think we are about to go live.
Yes, sir. It's live, sir. I'm beginning this session.
Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. Formal good evening to everyone. My name is Jaishree Chouhan, and I am a junior research fellow at the Department of English, University of Rajasthan. I welcome you to the stories of tribal identity and culture that will explore the role of tribal history and tribal representation in history in shaping cultural identity and ideology, curated under TMYS Review Summer 2023 in collaboration with the Center for Asia Pacific Initiatives, University of Victoria. We are also calling for the submission of essays, poems, and short stories under the project. To know more about the submission guidelines and the project architecture, please visit www.tellmeyourstory.biz. The topic for today is habitation and tribal identity. This evening, I consider myself very privileged to be in the company of our selected panelists, Dr. Walter Fernandes, Dr. Sudash Lama, and Dr. Budhaditya, who will shortly share their views and insights with us. The topic for today's discussion is the habitation and tribal identity under the sustainable habitation of tribes and sidelining the communities in environmental preservation discourses. Before we begin, I would like to introduce our speakers. Our first speaker for the session is Dr. Walter Fernandes. Dr. Walter Fernandes has been a faculty and director at Indian Social Institute, New Delhi from 1977 to 1999, editor of Social Action from 1985 to 93, founder director of Northeastern Social Research Center, Guwahati, and is again currently residing as the director there. He has worked extensively on tribal, gender, and livelihood issues, particularly development-induced displacement. He has over 50 books and 200 professional articles and 150 newspapers articles to his credit. He has been a member of social committees, including National Council for Land Reforms. We are delighted to have you on the panel, sir. Dr. Fernandes, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Our second speaker for this session is Dr. Sudash Lama. Dr. Sudash Lama teaches ancient Indian history as associate professor in Department of History, University of North Bengal, District Darjeeling in the state of West Bengal, India. His PhD title was From Born to Buddhism: Social and Cultural Changes of the Tamang. An inquiry has been made on how Tamang tribe became Buddhist. His area of research interest is ancient Indian social history, Buddhism, and tribal history, presently working on the educational status of scheduled tribes in West Bengal, attainments and challenges. We are delighted to have you on the panel, sir. Dr. Lama, thank you for joining us this evening. Our third speaker for the session is Dr. Budhaditya Das. Budhaditya Das is an assistant professor at the School of Human Ecology, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar University of Delhi. His work focuses on forest conservation, induced displacement, and tribal communities of central India. His research and writing have appeared in journals including Economic and Political Weekly, Seminar, Summerhill, and Oxford Development Studies. Dr. Das is also a social impact assessment practitioner and studies the impact of forced and land acquisition on agrarian communities. We are delighted to have you on the panel, Dr. Das. Thank you for joining us this evening. We'll now open the forum for discussion. I would request first Dr. Fernandes to share his insights, sir. Over to you now.
Thank you, Jaishree, and thank you, everybody, for this opportunity. Going to this theme, I would like to deal with three main issues, the ones you know already, concerning the tribes in general and the tribes and land in the Northeast in particular. Now, the first theme is changes in the tribal and management system and the implications for tribal land and land alienation. The second is development in the Northeast and its bearing on tribal land. Does it facilitate land alienation or loss of tribal habitation and displacement? The third is eco-critical discourses and the absence of tribal sustainable management systems in them. Does the tribal isolation lead to it? Would reintroducing them reinforce their isolation? And these are the three themes. Let me begin with the first, changes in the tribal land management. systems and their implications for tribal and land alienation. The issue here, as I understand, is not changes as such, but the type of changes that are introduced in the land management system and in the laws, and the way of introducing them. First, the type of changes. Most changes introduced in the law and in land management are aimed at facilitating land takeover for what are called development projects or national development, which is mainly understood as infrastructure building, and people are forgotten in that. In the process, they pay the price. Secondly, the process of introducing them is top down. The changes are imposed on them without giving the community an opportunity to discuss and understand them. So they are imposed on them, they are not ready to deal with them. So that facilitates land alienation and major environmental changes because of overuse of land, forests, and other resources. As there is, as it results, as land alienation, shortage of land results, they are forced to overuse land, forests, and other resources and destroy them further. I'll come back to that. Some individual landowners now, that is where we need changes. It doesn't mean that we have to go back to the tribal customary law alone. No, the changes are needed, but they have to come in the form of updating their traditions rather than replacing them with what is called modern, over which they have no control. Some individual land ownership system again can go along with it, but it has to be done by getting the community to go through a process, not through imposition from above. To come to the second issue, the development in the Northeast and its bearing on the tribal land. What is said about tribes in India as a whole is true to a greater extent about the Northeast. Most tribes of the Northeast continue to manage their affairs according to their customary law, though it is constitutionally recognized in only two of its 7 states. I'm referring to the 7 states, the 7 sisters. There is also Sikkim, the small brother of these 7 big sisters. Massive infrastructure projects are being built under schemes like the Look East or Act East policy, such as the Asian Highway, Asian Railway, as well as other transport projects within the region. Another major area of land loss is defense projects, which is massive. A third area that is now becoming the most important is water resource projects, particularly in Arunachal Pradesh and Sikkim. Arunachal Pradesh is a mega biodiversity zone and is on the verge of becoming a biodiversity hotspot. So displacement, land alienation, and loss of biodiversity go hand in hand because of these massive changes. And they have serious implications for their identity on one side and for their sustenance and livelihood security on the other. The third is eco-critical discourses and the absence of tribal sustainable management systems in it. Firstly, the tribal sustainable systems are more often than not absent in the discourse around ecology because much of it is initiated by the urban middle class environmentalists to whom the environment is what Anil Agarwal of CSC used to call beautiful trees and tigers. On the other side, to most tribal communities, these resources are their sustenance that has come down to their generation from their ancestors, and and is to be used by the present generation according to their needs and environmental imperatives. This discourse is absent in the approach to ecology and in the laws. The laws are meant to destroy the resources by the state and the corporate sector, and tribal impoverishment follows. So they are forced to make a transition from the traditional constructive to destructive dependence on the same resources. They use forests and other resources that were their tribal sustenance as uh, into a resource of intergeneration equity into commercial by after the destruction by the commercial forces. They continue to destroy them and use them for daily income. That vicious circle has to be broken. I'm finishing in 1 minute. Okay. uh, that vicious circle has to be broken. The updating of their customary laws and management systems and the changes have to come from within. We outsiders have a role to play in it, but that role there has to be a healthy marriage between the traditional systems and the formal systems. They cannot be kept isolated as museum pieces, but they have to be partners in this enterprise, not just what are called beneficiaries. The choice is not between their tradition and modernity, but modernizing their tradition. And that is the challenge because there are so many changes happening. The customary law has to change from many points of view, but it's time we help them to change, modernize it, rather than impose the law from outside. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Very aptly put. Changes needed, changes are needed, but in the form of updation of customary and traditional tribal laws, not in the form of imposing the modern laws on them. Thank you so much, sir, for sharing your views on that. Now I'll move on to our next speaker, Dr. Sudash Lama, to share his insight. Over to you now, sir.
Thank you, Jaishree, and good evening, Budhaditya Das and water Fernandes. And thank you, TMYS, for giving this opportunity for sharing my views on the topic concerned. So, as I'm going to share my points on the some of the sections of West Bengal, Darjeeling, Jalpaiguri, Sikkim, Kalimpong, and some of the plains of the West Bengal, like Malda, Dinajpur, Hooghly, Purulia, Jhargram. These are areas where I have done a study on the tribal habitats and the conservational steps taken by these peoples or used to be taken by these peoples. So as I want to recall my childhood days in the tea garden, so as I'm from tea garden and we had very different lifestyle what I am having today. So in that time, so we are having this forest. It's like forests were divided into the sections like core forest and the some of the open forest. And those who are residing in and around the forest areas or the Banavasti, so they are entitled to take the materials or they can cut the small trees or even they can take some of the fuels from the forest. But slowly the government has imposed certain rules that they are not been allowed to move on or go into deeper into the forest. But what the tribal peoples had the beliefs, they had the total concern about the forest and they worship the forest. So their whole lifestyle was dependent on the forest and the forest culture or the in and around of the forest. So when government of India or the government sometimes had issues or issuing the some kind of advisory that the peoples are not being allowed to go into the deeper of the forest, so their kind of faith was been attacked, or at somehow they were being morally been depressed. So when they are not being allowed to go hunting for the hunting for the in the forest, when they are not allowed to go in the deeper forest for some kind of like herbs, some kind of the some kind some types of the uh, woods, so for the fuel. So these are the things that totally hampered or the heckle their like beliefs. Some and the in early time of Darjeeling or the Jalpaiguri and the Sikkim. So what we had that these were the areas totally like dense forest and the least peoples were residing over there. So there wasn't tea plantation, there was only forest and the few like the Janjatis or the tribals were used to reside over there, just like Lepcha, Bhutia or the Rava, Maize, Toto. These are the some indigenous peoples who used to reside over there. And they had totally good access into the forest or the all the areas was open for them, and they used to practice zoom cultivation. There was no any concept of the so my and thine or the my property, your property. But slowly, with the colonial masters, they introduced tea plantation, and they introduced the policy of like a reserve forest. And with the tea plantation, we have the number of communities has come into this area. It's like Tamang and the Thapa, Bangar, and the many more communities who has Mongolian stock come into the Darjeeling, Sikkim, and the Doers, and even from the like Central Indian tribes, Urao, Munda, Chikbadai, they come into the Doers. So now we have the maximum indigenous tribals who come into this zone, and they are having their own way of uh, practicing on we are practicing and preserving the nature. But whatever we had the literature that they never harmed, they never devastated, or they never cut down the whole of the forest. And if they are quite happy in their own like small habitations in the huts. But with the colonial masters, they started like kuli pratha and the cutting of the trees or the cleaning of the forest. So to make the railways and to for the bungalows, so he started cutting down the trees and the clearing the forest, and he started there the making the like kuli paras or the to make the like houses or the villages for the like coolies who were employed in the tea garden from the who were migrated from the like Nepal and the Chotanagpur and some other areas. But slowly, like as we moved on into the postmodern times, and recently what we have this migration has like reverse migration has been started. Now the peoples are not been like enjoying the earlier habitat of these areas where they happily used to live, just like in the forest, in the tea gardens. They're now their reverse migration has been started due to the like adverse policies in the tea garden and the some anti-tribal policies in the forest. Now forests are not been sufficient. The forest, the earlier what they used to have, this is what I have like one story that one of the old mates. So we had a talk with him. So he said whenever we used to enter in the forest, we used to worship the any of the trees whichever comes closer. So they never cut down the huge trees, or they always worship the trees, and they always put they plant the saplings of two if they cut down one. So this was the like a system earlier we used to have. But right now the government has the different policies. They are not inclined to have the planting more and more trees, and they're not allowing the tribal to practice their like a faith or like the earlier kind of practices, customary laws. So these things and the adverse policies of tea plantation. So in tea plantation earlier they used to have good medical facilities, schooling system, and everything they used to have. But right now these rights has been taken away. Now they are being just wage workers. They have to work in a garden for 8 hours, and then they're getting 200 and 250. So in for that, the peoples who are now been little bit concerned about their livelihood, they are migrating. They are migrating towards Chennai or in the metro cities, that I should call in the metro cities, it's like Chennai, Kerala, Punjab, Delhi, in these areas. So in this way, that like we are totally uprooting a total generation or indigenous peoples. Though whoever migrated to other areas, they are not being able to follow their like earlier laws or their customs. They are not being accustomed with the like the what the earlier people used to have. Now what we find that like what we feel that the tribals are being like totally uh, not totally but slowly been uprooted from their cultural habitat or the center of culture, or they are not being allowed to follow their own culture or their own habitat or practices. So and slowly, like in these areas, it's like Darjeeling, Sikkim, Duars, and the Dinajpur, Malda, and the Hooghly. So slowly, the progress, the pace of progress or the development has been totally devastating the root of tribals. So in my like presentation, I would like to share that the uh, tribals, whoever residing in these areas, are been slowly been uprooting or uprooted, or they are been distancing themselves, or they have been compelled to distance from their like original habitat or the original homeland or the original center of the cultures. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much for your insights. Tribals, as we have been the tribal communities have been uprooted from their cultural and natural habitats due to the contemporary the current policies that are anti-tribal in nature. Thank you so much, sir. Now I come to moving on to our last speaker of this evening, Dr. Das. I would request Dr. Das to share his insights. Over to you now.
Um, Thank you so much, Jaishree. Very good evening to my co-participants in this panel discussion, Dr. Walter Fernandes and Dr. Sudash Lama. Thank you to TMYS, Tell Me Your Story, for inviting me to participate in this discussion. Jaishree, if I can request you, I have a brief presentation just so that my thoughts are organized for 10 minutes.
Of course, sir. Please.
And it's on your screen. I hope all of you can see it.
Yes, sir.
Um, so I will make four quick points in these 10 minutes. The first, of course, the very important fact to recognize when we think about Adivasi and indigenous societies in India is that our knowledge of tribal societies is mainly or largely based upon the writings and research of non-tribal persons. In the last 200 years, anthropologists and colonial officials and bureaucrats and policymakers, who are all largely non-tribals, have been writing on Adivasi societies, and that is a problem, right? So I have here the photograph of one of our very young sort of sociologists, Dr. Abhay Khaka, who passed away a few years ago. So we are now beginning to have Adivasi intellectuals. There's Gladson Dungdung, there's Professor Virginius Khaka, there is the Jharkhand author Hansad Suendra Sekhar. But we still have a long, long way to go, right? That's one thing to note. The other things, of course, there is a debate amongst academics on the term itself, whether we should use tribals or Adivasis or Vanvasis or indigenous. And each of these, I will not go into the debate in detail, but each of these term has its own politics, its own history, and therefore, for example, the word tribal is implicated in the colonial way of classifying Indian society, right? And how the colonial rulers divided Indian society into castes and tribes. So this is something that we need to understand. And in many countries, for example, in US, New Zealand, in settler colonial societies, now universities and institutions have started recognizing. So, for example, in the place where the university stands, it's who did the land originally belong to, which indigenous community, and they've started to speak and recognize these things. Something that we also need to look forward to do. My second point is that the way we imagine tribal societies, or how we think of Adivasi societies, is, as of course, as my previous panelists have talked about, there is a very long and deep association with forests and nature, and the environment, and that is the topic of today's discussion. But I'd like to point that there is a flip side to this kind of association, where we imagine Adivasis to be only restricted to forest communities, or to forest areas, and to remote hilly tribal areas, right? Now, this is not true. On your screen on the left, you can see a group of women and children in Adivasi area in Madhya Pradesh going for work. And national data tells us actually that Adivasis are one of the largest groups of internal migrants. They migrate to very far away places for work, for to work in cities and towns far away from their homes. There's a high level of migration and mobility in Adivasi societies today. On your right, you can see in the fringe of a forest, a farmer plowing the field using a tractor. So we need to sort of start rethinking Adivasi societies in the light of these changes that are happening. I'm not going into the debate of the good or the bad of it, but definitely this change is happening, and we need to take recognize it very importantly. My third point, and this is very paradoxical, is that on the one hand we, as I said, we are we recognize, and even the government talks about how the Adivasi is sort of nature, is very close to nature, or worships nature and protects nature. But on the other hand, um, in the name of nature conservation, a large number of Adivasi families and households are being actually forced out of forests and national park across India today. And I will give you two examples. On your right is a table that you can see, which tells you the number of families that have been relocated from tiger reserves in the last 15 years, right? So these are just five tiger reserves, all of them in central India, in the states of Madhya Pradesh and Maharashtra. And you can see that in just these five reserves, 10,000 families have been relocated in the last 15 years, right? And we have 50 tiger reserves in India today. So, under the National Tiger Conservation Authority's scheme, these people have been given 15 lakh rupees and moved out of the forest. And in a research article, we have shown how most of this is not. I mean, the scheme is called voluntary relocation, but it is actually not voluntary. They are forced out. My second example is very famous actually now, from the Kuno National Park in Madhya Pradesh, where recently the Indian government has introduced cheetahs, African cheetahs from Africa, and you can see a wall there in that image. That wall was just built 2 years ago in the Kuno National Park in preparation for the cheetahs to come, and on the other side of that wall is the forest where the Adivasis used to collect fuel wood, fodder, and very importantly, used to harvest gum for their livelihood. So this is again this is a new paper that will come out in some time, but we've documented how the Seheria Adivasis of Kuno National Park um, had a very old system of collecting cheed and sort of demarcating cheed trees and then collecting the gum, and now all that has stopped because of this kind of conservation, right? So here the paradox is that on the one hand we would like to sort of limit them to the forest, on the other hand we sort of make them conservation refugees. um, so which brings me to the point of of laws, and particularly two very important national legislations that are actually meant to stop this kind of eviction, right? Some of you may have already heard about it. Others, I will not speak about the laws in detail, but there is a land acquisition law from 2013, which is the National Land Acquisition Law, which is now replaced the Colonial Land Acquisition Law of 1894. I mean, we have with us Dr. Walter Fernandes, who's worked on development and displacement of tribal communities. Um, and under the colonial law, hundreds of thousands of tribals have been displaced without any sort of compensation or even recognition of what they have lost. We have a new law which tries to safeguard the rights of tribal communities. We also have the very famous Forest Rights Act of 2006, um, which tries to protect the forest rights of tribal communities in India. And both these laws actually enshrine a very important principle, which is now well recognized in international law, which is called the principle of free, prior, and informed consent. Right, which is that basically, if there is a development project, you have to ask the people who are affected by it whether they want it or not, and you can only evict them if they are willing to. You can only acquire their land, or you can acquire their resources only if they are willing to give it. You cannot take it by force, right? So maybe I will take up some questions on the status of these safeguard laws in the question answer session. This is again very famous case from the bauxite mining case in Odisha, in which the Supreme Court actually stopped mining in the Niamgiri Hills and protected the rights of tribal communities, and said that it's the Gram Sabha, the village assembly, which has to take the call on whether to allow mining or not. Right. So then, what is the very concluding my this thing? What is the way forward in this scenario? I think we need to sort of think in terms of four things. One, of course, recognizing Adivasis as citizens on equal terms, as citizens with who have individual constitutional rights and freedom, including, of course, affirmative action and reservations. Um, Safeguarding their rights to land, forests, and resources, safeguarding through the laws that I've talked about, but also plugging a lot of loopholes that are now emerging, and how governments are trying to circumvent these laws. And finally, the other, of course, part is that one wishes that in the course of the future, many more Adivasi intellectuals, scholars, and artists and poets write their own stories and histories, and much more than non-Adivasi persons, and sort of protecting identity in the form of languages, cultures, cuisines, and architecture. So I draw your attention to a very new report that has just come out, which is a collection, which is on the left. There's called Recipes for Coexistence, which is a collection of food recipes based on wild foods, compiled by women, Gond women in the Panna Tiger Reserve in Madhya Pradesh. And there's a book that is on Santhal houses, architecture of Santhal houses in Jharkhand, and it's called In Forest, Field, and Factory. It's these kinds of things that sort of suggest to us the ways in the future. I hope I've not gone over time. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. Uh,
Thank you so much, sir, for sharing the way forward, of course, for telling us about the safeguard laws as well, and very rightly put by you. In today's time, the very political nature of narratives and discourses, it is crucial to have more and more voices, intellectuals coming from tribal communities, need to change how we think of Adivasis and Adivasi societies. Thank you, sir, again. We will now quickly move on to the question and answer session. The first question to Dr. Walter Fernandes, sir. Sir, the first question to you is, do you think the changes in traditional land management systems of tribes in India and the resultant land alienation is harming the regional natural environment? Any comment on that, sir?
Yes, very much so. Uh, for one, their land is taken over, they are left without their resources, and they have no other choice after that but to destroy the resources which they had preserved for centuries. Take, for example, forests. Once they are deprived of their land, deprived of access to forests, then they, more often than not, they go around as often as bonded laborers of forest timber smugglers, timber contractors, and they keep destroying. Or by themselves, they cut those trees for sale as firewood because they have no other source of income. And that continues the vicious circle. The second is internal alienation, very often, internal land alienation, the tribal elite taking over more and more of their land, class formation. So that again results in much destruction of their land. I won't go beyond that. If you have need clarification, I can give it later.
All right, sir. All right, sir. I'll come to my next question, sir. My next question is to Dr. Sudash Lama. Sir, the Himalayan ecosystem is very crucial for the sustainability of the regional and continental environment. So is for the indigenous population. How does the displacement of these tribes are affecting the this ecosystem?
Yeah, thank you, Jaishree, for the question. It's affecting a lot. So, as we have some of the examples from the railway route to the Sikkim and some of the dam project in the Tista and in the Assam, and we have many protests from the Sikkim that are against the dam project and even for the railway route. So where they are displacing the huge number of tribal peoples and some of the core areas of the tribal habitation too. So this not only been affecting some of the areas of the tribal habitation, but it will open up the whole tribal habitation for the in general. And as the Indian constitutions in some of the past, some of the definition of the tribals said, the tribals have never been open up with the others. So they are been happy with the clusters or among the peoples. So whenever there is encroachment, not exactly encroachment, but when there is like a whole area is open for the each and everyone, and the elite class or the wealthy people and the influential people, so they try to influence these tribals to move either deeper or to go out. So these kind of like a Himalayan ecosystem is meant for not for the like a huge development, neither for neither for any kind of huge buildings, and this is purely meant for the certain peoples who purely respects the natures. So whenever we come for the development projects or the huge developments or the some kind of inviting the like others for the like construction of the huge buildings and the roads, so this will obviously will not only affect the like, tribals and they move out there from their like habitation, but even the like ecosystems will be totally be displaced. Just like one examples that in near of the one of the dam of the Tista River. So the road approaching to Sikkim is like going down. Okay, and this area is being just like we know is very seismic zone, and there's a huge construction, and the tribal peoples are slowly either moving into the deeper or going out. And whenever they're going out, they are totally out from their like own culture. So this Himalayan ecosystem is, as in my opinion, it's very essential to have the tribals who worship nature, who respects nature. So otherwise, this ecosystem will be collapsed and for the all.
Thank you, sir. My next question will be to Dr. Budhaditya Das. Sir, as you briefly touched upon the land acquisition laws, my question is on that point only. Can you please explain how does the established land acquisition laws and policies affect indigenous habitation? Can you comment more on that?
Right. Thank you, Jaishree. So, as I was saying that for 100 years, right, from 1894 till 2012, 2013, we had the Colonial Land Acquisition Act, which the British government had made, and that had no provisions for actually protecting the rights of communities, not just tribal, but all farming communities who were dependent on land. And after a long and protracted sort of movement, and with the intervention of parties and even the judiciary, we have this new 2013 Land Acquisition Act. Now, the interesting thing is that if you see globally, the 2013 Land Acquisition Act is actually one of the most progressive laws, land acquisition laws in the world. There are provisions, so you have to do a social impact assessment before any acquiring any land. Section 41 says that as far as possible, no land will be acquired in scheduled areas. As far as possible, land will be acquired only as a last resort, a demonstrable last resort. There is, as I mentioned, you have to take the consent of the Gram Sabha before acquiring land. The compensation has to be paid. Before displacement, you have to actually rehabilitate and resettle the communities. So there are a large number of measures that are already in place. The problem is that the bureaucracy and the state governments are still treating as if it is the old colonial law that is in existence, right? So they are still not willing to implement this law. They are actively looking at ways in which to circumvent or subvert the law that is of the parliament, and sort of you know acquire law as land as if we are still living in the 1894 land acquisition act regime. Yeah,
Right.
thank you.
Th- Thank you, sir, for this more information on this topic. My next question, briefly, I'll ask to Dr. Fernandes. Sir, the eco-critical discourses have been criticized for excluding tribal knowledge systems of sustainability, but hasn't the social self-isolation become one of the causes behind this exclusion?
Well, I do not think so, because it is not self-isolation, but it's isolation imposed by outsiders on the tribes. Now, that factor has to be remembered. And then, because of attacks on their land and forests, they tend to isolate themselves. Now, it's important to look at this isolation as an enforced action from outside, and then they want to change, but they need to change on their terms. So what has happened is that much of the uh, ecological discourse is controlled by the urban middle class environmentalists, to whom, as I said, the forests and natural resources are beautiful trees and tigers for the enjoyment of the tourist, the middle class tourist. And that's where it's not isolation, but contradiction between these two views. The tribes want to be away from this middle class view of middle class stakeholders who just want them as museum pieces and as trees and tigers, not as participants in an enterprise. And that factor cannot be ignored. Their right to these resources as their sustenance, as their livelihood, has to be recognized, and they have to be allowed to change on these terms. And we can facilitate that change outsiders, but the changes has to come from within. Exactly how, that is something we need to discuss. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir, for clearing this point to us. My next question will be to Dr. Lama. Sir, do you think the cultural plurality and multiple identities of the sub-Himalayan tribal population have affected their social inclusion, leading to the sub-national feelings of isolation?
Yeah, it's very obvious one. I can be very correct that the cultural plurality and multiple identity of the tribals having isolated the tribals in the not only in the West Bengal, in the Northeast, even other areas too. So if we take some examples of Northeast, that we are having number of tribals, they are never being come into closure, they never in come into friendship, as the tribals believes in the kinship relationship and the clan relationship, or they obey only the clan orders and they never go beyond the clan relationship or the kin relationship. So as that thing, like they, what I said even earlier, I said like the tribals are very close to. So they never been open up with the others. They have their own kind of belief. They have own faith. They have own customary laws. So and these systems are being like vary from tribal to tribals. Even some peoples who may not, I mean, some tribals who are exactly some communities who may not be in scheduled or scheduled tribe, but earlier their practices are, or originally they are the been tribal. So when they comes closer, there will be some kind of like conflict of the like customary laws and the way of like worshipping, the way of like having the system prevalent. So the in the Darjeeling we have huge number of communities who are being divided into the different clan or the communities or the even the in the even like in their like names. So whenever we are having of the like a national feeling or used to have a tribal feeling, so we differ in that things. Then always they saying like these tribals having their own areas and this tribal claims own areas, on way of the like a statehood or on way of the system. In this way, so we are like very much unfortunate, like those who are staying in the like in and around of the tribals, so they are not being able to coming into the coming into the one point of like of the like tribalhood to attain a single national feeling or the nationalism. So it's obviously like cultural plurality and multiple identities has affected the feeling of subnationalism. Even they are distancing from themselves.
Okay, now I'm there. Sir, last question to Dr. Budhaditya Das, sir. Sir, ecology and ecological concerns are often overlooked by political and economical quarters. Do you think communities are often neglected whose living is directly dependent on the well-being of the forest? And to give you the example, the development projects like large dams and which have known to displace people from their place of origin. How does this affect Adivasi identity and livelihood as well? Please comment on that, sir.
Thank you, Jaishree. I think Dr. Fernandes has answered this question very well, and that he's quoted Anil Agarwal, that we think of basically ecology and environment as too narrowly, right? In terms of, as he said, tigers and tribals, tigers and trees, beautiful trees and tigers. So we need to think of nature and more broadly beyond charismatic species. And I teach at the School of Human Ecology, and one of the things that we try and do throughout with our students and researchers is that we need to rethink our position in nature and our position vis-a-vis nature, right? So when you think of ecology and ecological concerns, think, for example, of traditional ecological knowledge, traditional environmental knowledge of indigenous communities throughout the country, right? So there is a lot of talk now on sustainability, low carbon lifestyles, low carbon pathways. I mean, we are talking about communities which are already, have a very low ecological footprint, have a very low carbon footprint, who have traditional ecological knowledge. For example, even now there's this talk of entomophagy and how insects can be the sort of this answer to our food crisis. And again, I'm sure both my panelists are very well versed with the Northeast. So there are cultures of entomophagy, of consuming insects. So I think we really need to rethink the way, abandon this middle class sort of position of thinking of nature as outside, pristine, and some that needs to be protected far away from human society, while we sort of continue to live our sort of lifestyles of high consumption, high carbon footprint lifestyle. Yeah.
Right, sir.
So
Right, sir.
The lens has to be turned on us. We have to think about us before sort of trying to this thing or them. Yeah, yeah.
Right, sir. Very rightly put, sir. Sir, last question for today's session is from the audience for Dr. Walter Fernandes. Sir, the question is the principle of free, prior, and informed consent really making any change? This is from
Well,
the audience.
if it is followed properly, it can and it should. In practice, uh, take for example, the 2013 Act introduces it to some extent, 80%. But the problem is that the at the village level, the big farmers are ready to part with their land if they get a good price, and because their children study in English medium schools and they wouldn't like to come back to the village, they would rather get an urban job and gets if they get a good price, they are ready to part with their land, and they are also the village leaders, and they are the ones who can easily put pressure on the remaining people to get that 80% consent. Now, uh, 80 or 70%, depending on the type of alienation. So it's more of, there are two things. One, as Dr. Das said, the bureaucrats are still thinking in terms of the Land Acquisition of Act 1894, and they would like to stick to that as far as possible because it's easier to acquire land under that. Two, they have created a vested interest in the big farmers in parting with their land, and that goes against the mediums and small farmers to whom the land is livelihood, and the agricultural workers and others who too are interested parties. So while fair, free, prior, and informed consent is a good principle, the problem is the bureaucratic behavior and local big farmer behavior that have a vested interest in this system goes against it. So it's not as black and white. You have a law and then it works. No. If it works, it's good.
Right, sir. Well, so this last question, this brings us to the end of today's session. I thank all the panelists once again for sharing invaluable perspectives on this topic. Thank you again, sir, Dr. Fernandes, Dr. Sudash Lama, Dr. Budhaditya Das. Have a lovely evening. This is to remind again to the audience that we are calling for submission on tribal history and tribal representation in history, the details of which can be viewed on www.tellmeyourstory.biz. We will come back to you soon with our next panel discussion on this project. Till then, good night, everyone. Good night, sir.
Thank you.